Baby Triceratops lost and alone. Then a T-Rex does something incredible. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The prehistoric jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, its towering ferns swaying gently in the breeze. Shafts of golden sunlight broke through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with flickers of light. But the beauty of the scene was lost on the small, trembling creature huddled beneath a low cluster of leaves. The baby Triceratops, no taller than a large dog, was alone. Its wide, frightened eyes darted around the clearing, its breathing coming in shallow, panicked bursts. Its small horns, barely more than nubs, trembled with its every shiver, and its calls for its herd had long since faded into silence. It had been hours, maybe longer, since the baby had been separated. It hadn't meant to wander too far from the herd. The bright flowers in the distance had been so tempting, their colors rich and vibrant, and its curiosity had gotten the better of it. But when the baby looked up again, its family was gone. Now it was lost. The jungle, once a playground of wonder, had turned into something vast and frightening. Every sound seemed amplified, the distant cries of creatures, the rustle of leaves in the underbrush, and the thudding footsteps that echoed through the ground, deep and ominous. The baby let out a soft, pitiful cry, hoping against hope that its mother would hear. The sound faded into the stillness, swallowed by the thick air. Nothing answered. The baby's tiny feet shuffled nervously as it glanced toward the shadows of the jungle. There was no safety here. It needed to move, needed to find its herd before something else found it. But moving through the dense ferns was difficult, and every step felt like an invitation for danger to pounce. And then it came. The sound started softly at first, a rhythmic pounding that made the earth vibrate beneath its feet. Thud, thud, thud. Each step grew louder, heavier, until it was unmistakable. A predator was near. The baby froze, its small body trembling so violently that its legs felt like they might give way. From the shadows of the trees, something enormous emerged. A towering figure stepped into the clearing, its scales gleaming faintly in the filtered sunlight. Its massive jaws opened slightly, rows of razor-sharp teeth catching the light. A deep, rumbling breath escaped its throat, like the low growl of a storm rolling in. The baby stared, its heart pounding so loudly that it was sure the creature could hear it. Tyrannosaurus Rex. The T-Rex's yellow eyes locked onto the baby Triceratops, unblinking and terrifying. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. The baby's mind screamed at it to run, but its legs wouldn't obey. It could do nothing but stare at the monster towering over it, its shadow stretching across the clearing like the promise of doom. The T-Rex tilted its head slightly, as though sizing up its prey. It took one slow, deliberate step forward, the ground shuddering beneath its weight. The baby flinched at the sound, curling its body tighter as if that might make it disappear. This was it. It squeezed its eyes shut, bracing for the attack. But the attack never came. Instead, the baby felt a gust of warm air sweep over it, accompanied by the faintest touch of something soft, not sharp. Cautiously, it cracked one eye open. The T-Rex was still there, its massive head now lowered close to the ground, so close that the baby could see its nostrils flaring as it sniffed curiously. The baby blinked, unsure of what to do. Was the T-Rex just playing with its food? It remained frozen, every instinct in its body screaming for it to stay still, to make itself as small as possible. But the T-Rex didn't lunge. It didn't roar, simply looked at the baby. The T-Rex tilted its head again, its yellow eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to make sense of what it was seeing. It let out a deep rumble, a sound so low that it vibrated through the air. And then, to the baby's surprise, it did something completely unexpected. It stepped back. The baby blinked again, its fear momentarily replaced by confusion. The T-Rex, this massive, terrifying predator, had stepped away. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't chasing. It was just watching. For a moment, the baby didn't move, too afraid that any sudden motion might change the T-Rex's mind. But when the dinosaur didn't lunge again, the baby slowly uncurled itself, lifting its head just slightly. It let out a soft, tentative chirp, a sound that was half a question, half a plea. The T-Rex blinked, then let out a low snort, the force of it ruffling the baby's frill. Its jaws opened slightly, revealing those rows of teeth once again, but the movement wasn't aggressive. It was almost curious. The baby stared up at the towering predator, its fear slowly giving way to something else. Wonder. The T-Rex turned its head and glanced around the clearing, as though scanning for something unseen. The baby watched it carefully, still ready to dart into the ferns at the first sign of danger. But the T-Rex didn't leave. Instead, it let out another soft rumble, quieter this time, almost gentle, and then lowered itself onto its haunches. The baby blinked. That wasn't something predators did, was it? It had seen its mother lie down this way, back when the herd had stopped to rest in the shade of the trees. The T-Rex's enormous tail swept across the ground as it settled into place, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was being careful not to startle the baby. The baby tilted its head, still trembling but now more from confusion than fear. Slowly, hesitantly, it took a single step forward. Its small foot pressed into the dirt, making a faint sound that echoed louder in the silence of the clearing than it should have. The T-Rex turned its head sharply at the sound, and the baby froze again. But the predator didn't roar, didn't lunge. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, blinking once, its yellow eyes softening in a way the baby hadn't thought possible. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't chasing. The baby took another step, this one a little less hesitant. Then another, and then something incredible happened. The T-Rex lowered its snout all the way to the ground, so close that the baby could feel the warmth of its breath. The predator, this massive, fearsome creature, stayed perfectly still, as though inviting the baby closer. The baby let out a soft chirp, its fear fading completely now. Carefully, it reached out with its small nose, touching the T-Rex's snout for the briefest of moments. The T-Rex didn't move. It simply sat there, its yellow eyes watching with an expression that was almost gentle. The baby pulled back, letting out another chirp, this one higher-pitched, as though testing the strange new relationship. To its astonishment, the T-Rex responded with a sound of its own, an almost purring rumble deep in its throat that made the baby's tiny body vibrate. It wasn't a predator anymore, the baby realized. It was something else. Over the next few hours, the baby Triceratops stayed close to the T-Rex. At first, it felt strange, unnatural, even to follow a creature that was supposed to be its greatest enemy. But the T-Rex showed no signs of aggression. It simply stayed near the baby, keeping watch over the clearing with its head held high. When a distant rustle echoed through the jungle, the baby flinched, its tiny body pressing low to the ground. The T-Rex, however, turned its head sharply, its jaws parting as it let out a deep, reverberating growl that made the underbrush shake. The sound was enough to send whatever had been lurking in the shadows scurrying away, and the clearing fell silent again. The baby stared up at the T-Rex, its wide eyes full of awe. This creature, this towering predator that could have eaten it in a single bite, was protecting it. The T-Rex glanced down, snorting softly, before settling back into its place, its massive tail curling protectively around the baby. The baby hesitated for only a moment before curling up in the space the tail had created, its tiny body sinking into the warmth the T-Rex's scales provided. For the first time since it had been separated from the herd, the baby felt safe. And as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden light across the clearing, the T-Rex let out a soft, rumbling sigh, its yellow eyes watching the edge of the jungle for any sign of danger. The baby closed its eyes, its breathing slowing as it drifted into sleep. It wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, the jungle was alive with the sounds of a new day, chirping birds, buzzing insects, and the distant calls of creatures both large and small. Shafts of golden sunlight broke through the thick canopy, casting warm patterns across the clearing where the baby Triceratops and the T-Rex rested. The baby Triceratops stirred first, its tiny body rising and falling with each steady breath. It blinked its wide eyes open, lifting its head to look around. The world seemed less frightening this morning. The shadows didn't feel quite so deep, and the sounds of the jungle weren't as menacing as before. It turned its head and saw the T-Rex, still curled around the clearing's edge. The enormous predator's yellow eyes were half closed, as though it was dozing but not completely asleep. The baby chirped softly, a tentative sound to see if the T-Rex was awake. The T-Rex's eyelids lifted, and its gaze shifted downward to meet the baby's. Its nostrils flared slightly as it huffed out a breath, the faint gust of air ruffling the baby's frill. The baby flinched at first, but then it realized there was no threat, just the familiar warmth of the creature it had spent the night beside. The baby chirped again, this time louder, and stood up on wobbly legs. It stepped cautiously closer to the T-Rex, tilting its head as if trying to understand what the giant predator was thinking. The T-Rex watched it carefully, its massive tail swishing slowly behind it, but it made no move to attack or chase the baby away. Instead, it lowered its head to the ground, resting its massive snout in the dirt as it let out a low, rumbling sound, a kind of deep, calming hum. The baby froze at first, but then its instincts told it something unexpected. The T-Rex wasn't angry. It wasn't hungry. It was comforting it. The baby chirped in response, the sound higher-pitched and full of wonder. It edged closer, cautiously pressing its small nose to the T-Rex's rough scales. This time, the T-Rex didn't move. It let the baby explore, sniffing curiously at its massive jaws and the towering length of its tail. For a creature that could crush it with a single step, the T-Rex was strangely gentle. As the day stretched on, the bond between the unlikely pair grew stronger. The T-Rex, still looming like a mountain, began to act like something more than a predator, like a silent, watchful guardian. It stayed close as the baby wandered through the clearing, its heavy footsteps shaking the earth as it followed. When the baby tripped over a hidden root and fell with a small thud, it let out a startled cry. The T-Rex was there immediately, its massive head lowering as it sniffed at the baby, huffing softly as though checking for injuries. The baby scrambled to its feet, letting out a series of high-pitched chirps, part complaint, part reassurance that it was fine. The T-Rex let out a low rumble in response, its breath ruffling the baby's frill again before it stepped back, allowing the little creature to continue. As the afternoon wore on, the baby's confidence grew. It no longer moved as though expecting danger at every turn. With the T-Rex towering behind it, the jungle didn't seem quite so threatening. It wandered to a patch of soft grass, nibbling at the tender shoots while the T-Rex stood watch nearby, its yellow eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. A soft rustle echoed from the underbrush, and the T-Rex's head snapped in the direction of the sound. The baby froze, its tiny body tense, but before fear could take hold, the T-Rex let out a low, menacing growl, a sound so deep it vibrated through the ground. Whatever had been in the underbrush scurried away, the rustling fading into silence. The T-Rex huffed again, satisfied, and turned its attention back to the baby. The baby chirped softly, its gaze full of trust as it looked up at the towering predator. It didn't know why the T-Rex was protecting it, but it didn't question it either. All it knew was that it felt safe, and for the first time since it had been separated from its herd, it wasn't afraid. The bond between the two deepened over the following days. The baby followed the T-Rex everywhere, its tiny feet scrambling to keep up with the dinosaur's massive strides. At first, the T-Rex seemed confused by the baby's persistence, occasionally stopping to glance back with a huff, as though wondering why this small creature insisted on tagging along. But it never left the baby behind. When the T-Rex waded through a shallow river, the baby followed, stumbling over the smooth stones as it splashed after its enormous protector. When the T-Rex paused to rest beneath the shade of a massive tree, the baby curled up beside its tail, its small body rising and falling as it napped peacefully. Once, as they moved through the dense jungle, a pack of small predators, sharp-clawed raptors, appeared from the shadows. The baby let out a terrified cry, its legs trembling as it tried to hide behind the T-Rex's massive leg. The raptors hissed, their sharp teeth glinting as they spread out, circling the pair like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. The T-Rex turned its head slowly, its yellow eyes narrowing as it took in the threat. It let out a low growl at first, the sound rumbling through the air like distant thunder. The raptors hesitated, but only for a moment. One of them lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air. And that was when the T-Rex roared. The sound was deafening, a primal, earth-shaking roar that sent birds scattering from the treetops and made the ground quake beneath their feet. The raptors froze mid-attack, their eyes wide with fear. The T-Rex snapped its jaws once, its teeth clashing together with a sound like thunderclaps, and the raptors scrambled back into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. The baby stared up at the T-Rex, its small body still trembling from the close call. But the T-Rex turned its head, its gaze softening as it looked down at the baby. It huffed out a breath, a sound that, by now, the baby had come to recognize as reassurance. Safe, the baby chirped, stumbling closer to the T-Rex and pressing its small body against the predator's leg. It had no words, no way to express the depth of its trust. But the T-Rex seemed to understand. Together, they moved on, the shadows of the jungle parting to let them pass. Days turned into a week, and the baby Triceratops thrived under the T-Rex's watchful care. It was no longer the scared, trembling creature it had been when the T-Rex had first found it. It explored the jungle with cautious curiosity, always glancing back to make sure the T-Rex wasn't far behind. The T-Rex, for its part, had grown used to the baby's presence. It no longer seemed confused by the little creature trailing after it. Instead, it watched over the baby with a quiet protectiveness, nudging it gently when it wandered too close to a steep slope or shielding it with its massive body when the weather turned cold and rainy. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the pair stood on the edge of a vast clearing. The jungle opened up before them, revealing a wide stretch of grassland that shimmered gold in the fading light. And then the baby heard it, a faint sound carried on the breeze, a low, trumpeting call that made the baby's heart leap in its chest. It turned sharply, its wide eyes scanning the horizon. The sound came again, clearer this time, and the baby let out a high-pitched chirp, its tiny body trembling with excitement. It's heard. The baby darted forward instinctively, its feet pounding against the soft earth. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed on the distant figures moving through the grass. There, on the far side of the plain, were massive shapes with familiar horns and frills. It's heard. His family. The T-Rex watched the baby carefully, its yellow eyes unreadable. It took a slow step forward, its massive body casting a long shadow across the clearing. The baby turned to look back at the T-Rex, its wide eyes full of uncertainty. It chirped softly, as though asking, "What now?" The T-Rex lowered its head slightly, huffing out a soft breath. Then, gently, almost carefully, it nudged the baby forward with the tip of its snout. "Go." The baby blinked up at the T-Rex, its tiny body trembling with emotion. It chirped one last time, a sound full of gratitude and sadness, before turning and running toward the herd, its calls echoing across the clearing. The baby Triceratops hesitated at the edge of the clearing, its tiny feet rooted to the ground. The calls of its herd echoed across the plain, familiar and comforting. But as it glanced back, the enormous figure of the T-Rex loomed like a silent giant. For days, this predator had been its protector, its guardian in a world that had seemed so vast and dangerous. How could it leave now? The T-Rex stood still, its yellow eyes watching the baby with an expression the little creature couldn't quite understand. There was no anger in that gaze, no hunger or threat. Only something deeper, something the baby could only describe as understanding. The T-Rex let out a slow, deep rumble, a sound that made the ground vibrate but carried none of the menace it once had. It was a sound of reassurance. "Go. You are safe now." The baby chirped softly, torn between two worlds. The distant silhouettes of its herd grew clearer as they moved slowly through the grassland. The calls of the other Triceratops grew louder, their horns and frills glowing golden in the light of the setting sun. This was where it belonged. But as the baby turned back toward the T-Rex, its heart ached. This towering predator, once the thing it feared most, had been the one to protect it, to shelter it from the shadows that had seemed so threatening. Couldn't understand why. Why would something so big and fierce care for something so small? The T-Rex stepped forward, its massive head lowering until its snout was only inches from the baby's face. The baby flinched instinctively, its small body trembling, but then it relaxed. The T-Rex let out another low breath, ruffling the baby's frill. It was gentle, so impossibly gentle, and it felt like a final goodbye. The baby let out a high-pitched chirp, one full of sadness and gratitude. It leaned forward, touching its small nose to the T-Rex's snout, just as it had done that first day. For a moment, they remained like that, two creatures from different worlds sharing a bond that defied nature itself. The T-Rex pulled back, its massive body casting a long shadow across the clearing as it straightened. It let out a soft, rumbling huff and turned slowly, its tail sweeping the ground behind it as it began to walk away. The baby watched, its heart pounding as the giant figure disappeared into the shadows of the jungle. With each step, the T-Rex grew smaller, its outline fading until it was nothing more than a memory, a silhouette against the trees. The baby turned back to the clearing, its gaze fixed on the distant herd. For a moment, it stayed still, its small body trembling, before it took the first step forward. Then another, and another. It began to run, its tiny legs carrying it across the soft grass as it chirped loudly, calling to its family. The herd answered. A massive female Triceratops broke away from the group, her horns towering high above the baby as she hurried toward it. Her calls were deep and low, full of relief and urgency. The baby's heart swelled as it ran faster, its little voice crying out in joy. When it reached her, she lowered her head, nudging the baby close to her side with a strength that was tempered by tenderness. The baby chirped, pressing its small body against hers, feeling her warmth, her strength. It was home. The herd gathered around them, their low rumbles filling the air as they sniffed and inspected the baby. There were no harsh scolds, no anger, only relief that their lost member had returned. The baby tilted its head back, looking toward the jungle one last time. The T-Rex was gone, but the memory of its towering form, its unexpected gentleness, would stay with the baby forever. The herd began to move, their massive forms shifting through the grass as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The baby followed close to its mother, its tiny legs working to keep up with the larger, steady strides of the herd. And yet, as it glanced back at the jungle, it couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Somewhere in those shadows, the T-Rex was out there, alone again. The T-Rex moved silently through the dense jungle, its massive form weaving effortlessly between the towering trees. The sounds of the herd were distant now, the calls of the baby Triceratops growing fainter with each step. It should have felt satisfied. It had done what no other predator would have done. Protected something small, something vulnerable, and delivered it safely to its family. But the T-Rex felt no triumph, no victory. Instead, there was a strange hollowness in its chest, as though it had left something behind. The predator paused near a stream, its yellow eyes staring into the rippling water as its reflection stared back. The T-Rex's jaws parted slightly, letting out a soft growl, a sound more like a sigh than a roar. For reasons it couldn't explain, its instincts had failed it. The baby should have been prey, and yet, it hadn't been able to harm the small creature. Instead, it had become something else, something fragile that the T-Rex had wanted to protect. The T-Rex shook its massive head, droplets of water scattering from its snout as it huffed out a breath. What had come over it? Was it loneliness? A sense of duty? It didn't know. All it knew was that for the first time in its life, it had felt something other than hunger or survival. And now it was alone again. The T-Rex lifted its head, scanning the darkening jungle as the shadows deepened. A distant call echoed through the trees, a roar from another predator marking its territory. The T-Rex's muscles tensed, its instincts sharpening once again. It turned, its footsteps heavy but deliberate, as it disappeared into the darkness. Days passed, and the baby Triceratops quickly adjusted to life back in the herd. It stayed close to its mother, never straying too far from her protective bulk. But the jungle no longer seemed so terrifying. The baby explored more now, venturing cautiously through the underbrush, its curiosity returning with each passing day. But no matter how safe it felt, the memory of the T-Rex lingered. Sometimes, when the herd stopped to rest and the jungle grew quiet, the baby would stare into the shadows, listening. It didn't know what it was waiting for. Maybe the sound of heavy footsteps, or the deep rumble of a familiar breath. Maybe it was just hoping to see the towering figure of the T-Rex one last time. But the jungle stayed silent. One afternoon, as the herd grazed in a sunlit clearing, the baby wandered to the edge of the trees. Its tiny feet crunched through the underbrush as it sniffed at the ground, searching for tender shoots to nibble. The sounds of the herd were still close, but for a moment, the baby felt that same pull, the same curiosity that had led it astray once before. And then it heard it, a low, deep rumble, so faint that it was almost a whisper. The baby froze, its ears perking up as it turned its head toward the sound. It was far off, almost hidden beneath the hum of the jungle, but the baby recognized it instantly. The T-Rex. Its heart leapt in its chest, a mix of fear and something else, something warm and familiar. The baby chirped softly, almost instinctively, as though hoping the sound would carry far enough for the T-Rex to hear. The rumble came again, closer this time. The baby glanced back at the herd, where its mother was grazing peacefully, unaware of the sound. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, the baby stepped forward, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. The jungle was cooler here, the sunlight struggling to break through the canopy. The baby moved carefully, its small feet pressing into the soft earth as it followed the faint sound. It didn't take long before it saw it. An enormous figure moving through the trees, its scales gleaming faintly in the dappled light. The T-Rex. The baby chirped again, louder this time. The predator froze, its massive head turning sharply as its yellow eyes locked onto the baby. For a moment, they stared at each other, neither of them moving. Then, slowly, the T-Rex lowered its head, its jaws parting slightly as it let out a familiar rumbling huff. The baby chirped in response, stumbling closer as its small tail swished behind it. There was no fear this time, no hesitation. It pressed its tiny nose against the T-Rex's snout, just as it had done before, and the predator remained perfectly still, allowing the small creature to come close. For a while, they stayed like that, two creatures from different worlds, reunited in the quiet shadows of the jungle. The baby chirped again, nuzzling the T-Rex's snout as if to say, "I missed you." The T-Rex let out a low rumble in response, its yellow eyes softening as it huffed out another breath. The baby knew it couldn't stay. It had a family now, a herd that would always keep it safe. But for this moment, it stayed close to the T-Rex, knowing that this bond, this strange, impossible bond, was something that would stay with it forever. The baby Triceratops stood beside the T-Rex, nestled in the cool shade of the jungle. For a creature so small, its trust in the towering predator seemed improbable, almost impossible, but there it was, undeniable. The T-Rex lowered its snout once more, exhaling a slow breath that ruffled the baby's frill. The baby chirped softly in response, the sound light and curious, as if asking, "Why are you here?" The T-Rex made no move to answer, of course, but its yellow eyes held something the baby had learned to recognize. It wasn't hunger, nor was it anger or dominance. It was something gentler, a quiet understanding, a silent bond that neither creature could explain. For a moment, they simply stood together, the jungle alive with the hum of insects and distant cries of other creatures. The baby glanced back toward the clearing where its herd still grazed peacefully, their large forms silhouetted against the sunlight. It knew it should return, knew it belonged with them, but something kept it there beside the T-Rex. The baby tilted its head, letting out another chirp. It was almost as though it was inviting the T-Rex to come along, to follow. The T-Rex rumbled softly, the sound reverberating through the ground, but it didn't move. It simply watched, its eyes steady and unblinking. The baby took another small step forward, pressing its nose gently against the T-Rex's snout, as though offering reassurance. "It's okay." The T-Rex let out a long breath, a low, rumbling sigh that felt almost like a response. It huffed softly, then straightened its massive body, its tail sweeping slowly across the ground behind it. The baby watched as the predator turned its head toward the depths of the jungle, its gaze scanning the shadows as though looking for something unseen. For the first time, the baby wondered about the T-Rex's life. Was it alone, too? Did it have a family somewhere out there, hidden among the trees? Or had it spent its days wandering this vast, endless world without purpose or direction? The thought tugged at the baby's small heart. For as terrifying as the T-Rex had seemed at first, there was a sadness to the creature now, a loneliness that the baby could almost feel. The baby chirped again, louder this time, as though trying to pull the T-Rex's attention back. The predator turned its head slowly, its yellow eyes narrowing slightly as it looked down at the small creature. The baby took a step toward the clearing, glancing back over its shoulder as if to say, "Come with me." For a long moment, the T-Rex didn't move. The baby's heart sank slightly, but just as it was about to turn back toward its herd, the T-Rex took a single, heavy step forward. The ground trembled beneath the predator's weight, but the sound wasn't frightening anymore. It was comforting, familiar. The baby chirped excitedly, stumbling forward as the T-Rex followed, its massive form weaving carefully through the trees. Together, they moved toward the edge of the jungle, the light growing brighter as the clearing came into view. The herd was still there, their horns and frills glowing golden in the afternoon sun. The baby's mother stood near the center, her large form towering over the others as she grazed peacefully. The baby paused at the edge of the clearing, glancing back at the T-Rex. The predator stopped just inside the shadows of the trees, its massive head lowered as it stared out at the herd. It made no move to step into the light. Instead, it stayed still, its yellow eyes watching silently. The baby chirped softly, nudging its small nose against the T-Rex's leg, as if to say, "Come on, it's safe." But the T-Rex didn't move. It let out a low rumble, the sound deep and steady, but there was no anger in it, only something that felt like reluctance. The baby tilted its head, confused. It chirped again, its calls growing higher-pitched, more insistent, but the T-Rex remained where it was. Slowly, it straightened its massive body, its gaze shifting toward the baby one last time. It was a look the baby didn't understand, something that felt like sadness or maybe even farewell. The T-Rex turned then, its heavy tail sweeping through the grass as it began to move back into the jungle. The shadows swallowed its form, its footsteps fading until all that remained was the rustling of leaves. The baby stared after it, its small heart aching in a way it couldn't explain. Chirped once, twice, hoping somehow that the T-Rex would return. But the jungle remained silent. The baby turned back toward the clearing, its tiny legs carrying it across the grass as it let out a long, low call. The herd responded immediately. Its mother lifted her head, her deep rumble filling the air as she turned toward the baby. The baby ran to her, its small body pressing against her side as she sniffed and nuzzled it, her warmth familiar and safe. The other Triceratops gathered around them, their low calls rumbling softly as they welcomed the baby back. But even as the herd began to move again, the baby couldn't stop glancing back at the jungle. Somewhere out there, hidden among the shadows, the T-Rex was still walking, still alone. The days turned into weeks, and life in the herd returned to normal. The baby Triceratops grew stronger, its small legs no longer wobbling as it followed the others through the plains and jungles. It learned to graze on the tender shoots of grass, to drink from the cool streams that trickled through the forest, and to stay close to its mother when predators were near. But no matter how safe it felt within the herd, the memory of the T-Rex lingered. At night, when the herd gathered in a circle to sleep beneath the stars, the baby would lift its head, staring out into the darkness. Sometimes, it imagined it could hear the soft rumble of heavy footsteps or the low, gentle sound of a breath that once brought comfort instead of fear. It missed the T-Rex. It didn't understand why the predator had cared for it, why it had protected it when it could have so easily ended its life. But the bond they had shared, however brief, was something the baby couldn't forget. One morning, as the herd moved through a wide clearing, the baby's sharp ears perked up at the sound of distant cries. The herd froze, their massive bodies going still as they listened. The calls were faint, carried on the wind, but they were unmistakable, the sounds of danger. Pack of raptors. The baby's mother let out a deep, warning rumble, her head lifting as she scanned the horizon. The herd began to shift, their horns lowering as they formed a protective circle. The baby chirped nervously, pressing close to its mother's side as the cries grew louder. And then, from the far edge of the clearing, the raptors appeared. There were at least a dozen of them, their sharp claws and teeth glinting in the sunlight as they spread out, circling the herd like wolves preparing for the hunt. The herd let out deep, bellowing calls, their horns angled to defend themselves, but the raptors were fast, darting in and out with terrifying precision. The baby cried out, its small body trembling as it pressed against its mother's leg. The raptors were everywhere, their shrill cries filling the air like a chorus of nightmares. And then the ground shook. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was unmistakable, deep and rhythmic, growing louder with every passing second. The raptors froze, their heads snapping up as they turned toward the source of the sound. The herd, too, fell silent, their massive forms going still as the tremors grew stronger. From the jungle, a figure emerged, the T-Rex. The baby's heart leapt, a chirp escaping its throat as the predator stepped into the clearing, its yellow eyes blazing. The raptors hissed and scattered, their cries turning to shrieks of panic as the T-Rex let out a roar that shook the ground. It was a sound of fury, a warning that echoed across the plains and sent every creature within earshot fleeing for their lives. The raptors didn't stand a chance. They turned and fled. The raptors scattered in all directions, their sharp cries drowned out by the T-Rex's deafening roar. It was a sound of raw power, primal and earth-shaking, echoing off the jungle canopy and vibrating through the ground. The herd of Triceratops, though enormous and strong, remained frozen for a moment, their collective fear turning to silent awe as they watched the predator stride confidently into the clearing. The baby Triceratops' wide eyes locked onto the familiar figure of the T-Rex. Even in the chaos, a feeling of recognition rippled through its small body, spreading warmth where there had been fear just moments before. The baby chirped, the sound small but sharp against the silence that followed the T-Rex's roar. The massive predator came to a stop, towering at the edge of the clearing. Its yellow eyes scanned the area quickly, noting the fleeing raptors and the herd's defensive circle. For a moment, the T-Rex simply stood there, its body still and imposing as it took in the scene. Then, slowly, it turned its head toward the baby. The baby let out another soft chirp, its trembling body pressing closer to its mother's side. The larger Triceratops shifted uneasily, their instincts screaming danger, but none of them moved, not yet. The T-Rex's posture was strange. It wasn't charging, wasn't lunging. It just watched. The baby chirped again, this time louder, and took a tiny, hesitant step forward. Its mother let out a low, warning rumble, her massive horns angling protectively. The other Triceratops joined her, their calls vibrating through the air like a wall of sound. It was a warning to the T-Rex, a united declaration that the herd would defend its own. But the T-Rex didn't move. It made no sound, no aggressive gesture. Instead, it lowered its massive head slightly, its yellow eyes softening as they locked onto the baby. For a long, breathless moment, the predator and the small herbivore stared at each other across the clearing. The baby tilted its head, its heart pounding as it chirped again, calling out not with fear, but with something else, trust. The herd fell silent. The T-Rex let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a roar, not a growl, but something gentler. It was almost the same comforting hum the baby had heard so many times before, the sound that had carried it to sleep in the safety of the jungle shadows. The herd didn't understand it, but the baby did. The T-Rex wasn't a threat. It wasn't an enemy. It was a protector. The baby Triceratops took another step forward, its small feet pressing into the soft earth. Its mother rumbled again, this time more uncertain than before, but the baby didn't stop. Slowly, carefully, it moved toward the T-Rex, as though drawn by an invisible thread. The herd watched, their massive heads turning to follow the baby's movements. Some of the older Triceratops stomped their feet or shook their heads, letting out low, unsettled rumbles, but none of them dared approach. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like the calm before a storm. The baby reached the center of the clearing and stopped. The T-Rex lowered its head even further, until its snout was only feet away from the baby. Its massive jaws, lined with razor-sharp teeth, opened slightly as it sniffed the air. A gust of its breath swept over the baby's frill, but the baby didn't flinch. Instead, it chirped softly, a sound full of innocence and trust. The T-Rex responded with a deep, quiet huff, as though acknowledging the baby's courage. Then, in a gesture that defied everything the herd knew about predators and prey, the T-Rex lowered its massive body onto its haunches, settling its weight onto the ground. It was a posture of peace, a sign that it meant no harm. The baby chirped again, stepping even closer. It pressed its small nose against the T-Rex's snout, just as it had done before in the safety of the jungle. The predator didn't move. It remained perfectly still, its yellow eyes watching the baby with an expression that could only be described as gentle. The herd let out a collective rumble, their fear giving way to disbelief. Never before had they seen such a thing. A Triceratops, a baby, standing face to face with the most fearsome predator in the land. And yet, there was no blood, no violence, only trust. The baby chirped once more, its tiny tail swishing behind it as it nuzzled the T-Rex's snout. The predator let out another soft rumble in response, a sound that vibrated through the ground but carried no menace. For the baby, it was a lullaby. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the clearing in hues of orange and gold. The T-Rex remained where it was, its massive form a silent, steady presence at the edge of the clearing. The herd of Triceratops began to relax, though their eyes remained fixed on the predator. Slowly, they returned to grazing, their movements cautious but deliberate. The baby stayed near the T-Rex, darting back and forth between its mother and the predator as though trying to unite the two worlds. It chirped happily, its tiny feet scrambling through the grass as it explored the space between them. The T-Rex watched the baby closely, its yellow eyes following every movement, but it didn't move from its spot. It seemed content to sit there, its tail curling around its massive legs as it listened to the hum of the jungle and the distant rumbles of the herd. For the baby, it was the perfect balance. Its family was there, strong and united, and the T-Rex, the creature that had saved it, protected it, was close too. It no longer felt torn between the two worlds. It had found a place where both could exist, however briefly, in harmony. The baby let out a chirp of delight, tumbling into a patch of soft grass. Its mother turned her head to watch, her deep eyes scanning the T-Rex once more. For the first time, she didn't let out a warning rumble. She simply watched. The T-Rex huffed softly, a faint sound that carried across the clearing like a breeze. It was as though it understood the unspoken truce, the fragile peace that existed between them. As the light faded and the stars began to appear, the herd began to move again, their deep calls filling the air as they turned toward the jungle. The baby stood, its small body silhouetted against the fading light, and glanced back at the T-Rex one last time. The predator remained still, its yellow eyes reflecting the soft glow of the rising moon. For a moment, it almost seemed to smile, though its massive jaws never parted. The baby let out a soft chirp, one filled with gratitude and something deeper, an unspoken promise that it would never forget. The T-Rex huffed in response, its deep rumble carrying across the clearing like a farewell. The baby turned and hurried to its mother, pressing close to her side as the herd began to disappear into the jungle. The sounds of their movement grew quieter and quieter, fading into the darkness until all that remained was the rustle of leaves and the faint call of distant creatures. The T-Rex stayed where it was, its massive body still silhouetted against the moonlit jungle. It watched the herd go, its yellow eyes lingering on the small form of the baby as it disappeared into the shadows. And then, slowly, the T-Rex turned and walked back into the jungle. Its heavy footsteps echoed softly through the trees, but there was no anger, no loneliness in its movements. For the first time, the predator carried something with it. A bond that couldn't be broken, a memory of a small creature that had trusted it when no one else would. And somewhere, deep in the jungle, the T-Rex let out a low, rumbling sound. It was neither a roar nor a growl. It was soft, almost like a song. One that no one else would hear, but one that carried the weight of something rare and beautiful. Trust. The herd moved as one through the darkened jungle, their massive forms weaving silently between the towering trees. The baby Triceratops stayed close to its mother's side, its tiny feet pressing into the soft earth with every hurried step. The familiar sounds of the herd, the deep, comforting rumbles and the steady beat of hooves, wrapped around the baby like a lullaby. But even as it walked safely with its family, the baby couldn't help but glance back. Its wide eyes scanned the jungle behind them, searching for any sign of the T-Rex's towering figure. The shadows held only silence now, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The T-Rex was gone. The baby chirped softly, its small voice swallowed by the noise of the herd. Its mother turned her head, letting out a deep, questioning rumble as though to ask, "What's wrong?" The baby didn't answer. It simply pressed closer to her massive form, finding comfort in her warmth, even as its thoughts lingered on the predator who had saved it. For days, the T-Rex had been its protector, its guardian in a world that should have been filled with nothing but fear. It didn't understand why the predator had acted the way it had, but it knew one thing for certain. It was grateful. The herd moved on, disappearing deeper into the jungle as the stars sparkled faintly above. In the days that followed, life in the herd returned to normal. The baby Triceratops fell back into the familiar rhythm of grazing, drinking from cool streams, and playing with the other young members of the herd. Its mother stayed close, her watchful eyes ensuring it never strayed too far again. But the baby never forgot. Every now and then, when the herd stopped to rest, the baby would wander to the edge of the trees and stare out into the shadows, listening. It hoped, though it didn't know why, that it might hear the distant sound of heavy footsteps, the deep rumble of the T-Rex's breath, or the soft, familiar hum that had once brought it so much comfort. But the jungle remained quiet. The baby would chirp softly into the darkness, its small voice carrying through the trees, but no answer ever came. It was as though the T-Rex had vanished completely, melting into the endless depths of the forest. The other young Triceratops didn't understand. They played together without worry, chasing each other through the grass and wrestling in the mud. The baby tried to join them, but something always felt different now. Couldn't forget the bond it had shared with the predator. Couldn't forget the T-Rex. Far away, deep in the jungle, the T-Rex walked alone. Its heavy footsteps echoed softly through the trees, its yellow eyes scanning the world around it with a quiet intensity. It hunted when it needed to, its instincts still sharp and unrelenting, but something had changed. The predator that had once been driven solely by survival now moved with purpose. Its gaze lingered on the edges of clearings, its massive head tilting slightly at the distant sounds of herds moving through the plains. But it never approached them. It was searching for what it didn't fully understand. Sometimes at night, it would pause and look up at the stars, their faint light breaking through the canopy above. It would close its eyes and let out a low, rumbling sound, soft and quiet, almost like a song. It was a sound no one else would hear, a sound that carried a weight the predator couldn't explain. And then it would move on, disappearing into the shadows once more. One morning, as the herd grazed in a sunlit meadow, the baby Triceratops wandered to the edge of the clearing. Its mother, distracted by the tender shoots of grass, didn't notice as the baby stepped cautiously into the shade of the trees. The baby chirped softly, its voice curious and searching. It knew it shouldn't wander far, but something pulled it forward, an instinct it couldn't ignore. The jungle was quiet, save for the distant hum of insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The baby moved carefully, its small feet pressing into the cool earth as it weaved between the ferns. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting patterns of gold and green across the ground. The baby chirped again, louder this time, its voice carrying through the stillness. And then it heard it, a low, familiar rumble. The baby froze, its heart pounding in its chest. The sound came again, closer now, deep and steady, like the hum of distant thunder. Slowly, the baby turned its head, its wide eyes scanning the shadows. And then it saw it. The T-Rex emerged from the trees, its massive form bathed in dappled sunlight. It moved carefully, its heavy footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Its yellow eyes locked onto the baby immediately, their sharp intensity softened by something the baby had come to recognize. Recognition. The baby let out an excited chirp, its small body trembling not with fear, but with joy. It took a step forward, its tiny feet stumbling slightly as it hurried toward the towering predator. The T-Rex stopped, its massive head lowering as it let out a soft, rumbling huff. The sound washed over the baby like a warm breeze, familiar and comforting. The baby chirped again, pressing its small nose against the T-Rex's snout, just as it had done so many times before. For a moment, the jungle fell silent. The two creatures stood together, predator and prey, small and mighty, bound by a connection that neither of them could explain. The T-Rex let out another low hum, the sound deep and steady, as though offering reassurance. The baby chirped in response, its tail swishing happily as it pressed closer. It had found its friend again. The baby stayed only for a short time, as though understanding that it couldn't remain in the jungle forever. Its herd was waiting, and its mother would notice its absence soon. But for those precious few moments, the baby stood beside the T-Rex, its small form dwarfed by the predator's towering presence. When the baby finally turned to leave, it glanced back one last time. The T-Rex remained where it was, its yellow eyes watching silently as the baby disappeared into the shadows. The predator didn't follow. Instead, it let out one final hum, a soft, low sound that carried through the trees like a farewell. The baby paused, tilting its head as though listening. Then it chirped in response, its voice light and clear, before hurrying back toward the clearing. The baby returned to the herd just as its mother lifted her head, letting out a low call of concern. The baby chirped loudly in response, rushing to her side and pressing close to her massive leg. Its mother sniffed the baby carefully, her deep eyes searching for any sign of danger. But when she found nothing amiss, she let out a soft rumble of relief, nudging the baby gently as though scolding it for wandering off. The baby chirped again, this time with a hint of playfulness, as if to say, "I'm okay." The herd began to move once more, their deep calls filling the air as they disappeared into the jungle. The baby stayed close to its mother, its tiny feet scrambling to keep up with her steady strides. But as they walked, the baby glanced back toward the jungle one last time. Somewhere out there, hidden among the shadows, the T-Rex was still walking, still watching, still protecting in its own silent way. And the baby knew, deep in its small but strong heart, that it would never forget the predator who had saved it. Sometimes miracles happen in the most unexpected places. Sometimes bonds were formed between those who were never meant to understand each other. And sometimes even the most fearsome creatures could become something more, a protector, a friend.